Imagine living in a house where every relationship is complicated, where secrets and broken promises hang in the air like dust. And then, the man your mother has been seeing for years, the one who promised to leave his wife, says he's moving in. How would you feel? Would you stand up and say no, or silently watch your world crumble? I have always thought of our house as a quiet place, a little refuge from the chaos of the outside world. But in reality, it was anything but quiet. Living with my mother, a woman whose life seemed to be a series of failed marriages, and my cousin, who was the only family member my age nearby, had shaped my life in ways that were both comforting and suffocating. My mother, at 60, carried herself with a kind of tired elegance, a woman who had known disappointment more intimately than most. She had been married 5 times and engaged once, each relationship leaving its own trail of stories, regrets, and subtle reminders of what she had endured. My brothers and I each had different fathers, a fact that often made holidays and family gatherings feel like navigating a complex web of half-remembered faces and obligations. I was 20 years old, at that delicate age where independence and attachment wrestled with one another. I loved my mother, despite her flaws and the chaos she seemed to attract. But sometimes I found myself wishing for something simple, something steady, a life without unexpected visitors, arguments about love and betrayal, or the constant presence of someone new every few months. Our home itself was a reflection of our lives, slightly worn, filled with echoes of past lives. The scent of old wood mixed with the faint trace of lavender she always used lingered in the air. There were photographs on the walls, some of people I barely remembered, and shelves stacked with trinkets collected from trips and former relationships. Every corner seemed to tell a story, some happy, many painful, but all undeniably hers. Living with my cousin, who was 3 years older than me, was another layer of familiarity. He wasn't just family. He was a confidant of sorts, someone I could sit with in silence and feel understood. Our conversations were casual, filled with teasing and shared observations about the people who came and went in our lives. He was a quiet anchor in the unpredictable tides of our home, despite the seeming normalcy of our daily routines: morning coffee, the clatter of dishes, the occasional arguments over trivial matters. There was always a sense of anticipation, an undercurrent of drama that I had grown accustomed to. My mother's relationships had always been a source of both fascination and anxiety for me. I knew better than to hope for simplicity. The moment I let my guard down, a new person, a new promise, or a new heartbreak would enter our lives. And yet, there were moments of beauty here. The way my mother laughed at old jokes, the quiet evenings spent reading in the living room, the rare Sundays when my cousin and I would cook together, it all made up the patchwork of a life that was messy but ours. Little did I know, a new chapter was about to begin, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about boundaries, family, and the limits of patience. The mornings in our house had a rhythm of their own, almost ritualistic in their predictability, yet underlined by a subtle tension that never truly faded. I would wake up to the faint light filtering through the curtains, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the occasional murmur of my cousin getting ready for his day. Even in these mundane moments, I felt the weight of the household pressing gently on my shoulders, reminding me that our lives were far from ordinary. Breakfast was usually a quiet affair. My mother would be perched at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hand, eyes scanning a book or occasionally flicking through her phone. There was a grace in her movements, an elegance that belied the turbulence of her past. Yet, even in her quiet moments, I could sense the invisible threads of her life stretching beyond our walls, the stories she never told, the people she had loved and lost, and the man who now occupied a peculiar place in her heart. Conversations with my cousin were the small islands of normalcy I clung to. We joked about everything, from the worn carpet in the hallway to the suspiciously tall stack of magazines on the living room table. His laughter, deep and reassuring, often made me forget, if only for a moment, the chaos lurking just beyond the threshold. But these moments were fleeting. Every shared smile carried with it the unspoken knowledge that change was always around the corner. It was impossible to ignore the pattern: men coming and going, promises made and broken, whispers behind closed doors. My mother, despite her age and the wisdom it should have brought, seemed caught in a cycle she couldn't or wouldn't break. I often found myself observing her with a mix of admiration and exasperation. She had endured so much, and yet seemed drawn to repetition, like a moth circling a flame it knew would burn. and then there was the house itself. The living room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, the couch worn and slightly sunken, where my mother preferred to sit. The walls, painted a soft beige, were lined with pictures, some of me as a child, some of my brothers, and some of faces I barely recognized. Each frame was a fragment of memory, a reminder of lives lived and loves lost. Walking through the house, I could feel the weight of its history pressing gently on me, whispering that nothing here was permanent. Despite all this, I tried to focus on what I could control: my space, my routines, my sense of calm amidst the storm. I would often retreat to my room, a small sanctuary, where I could read, write, or simply exist without interruption. My desk was cluttered with journals, scattered papers, and a few photos that I kept for comfort, reminders that even in chaos, there were fragments of stability I could hold on to. Yet, no matter how much I tried to insulate myself, the world outside my door was always intruding. My mother's phone would buzz, sometimes with messages from friends, sometimes from him, the man she had been seeing for years, who still hadn't left his wife despite countless promises. I could feel my stomach tighten whenever I thought about him. The thought of him moving into our home, stepping over the threshold into my carefully curated life, filled me with a mix of dread and indignation. It wasn't just the intrusion of a stranger. It was the intrusion of uncertainty, of emotional chaos, of a pattern I had longed to escape. And yet, I knew I couldn't simply speak my mind without consequences. The stakes were high. Our household, already fragile, could fracture under the weight of confrontation. And still, I found myself bracing for the inevitable, for the moment when I would have to voice my fears, my boundaries, my insistence that some lines should never be crossed. The tension lingered in the air like static before a storm. Every small decision: what to eat, when to leave the house, how to interact with my mother, was colored by the shadow of what might come. And yet, within that tension, I discovered something unexpected: a clarity of purpose, a recognition that my life, my space, my peace, were mine to protect, even in a house steeped in the past, surrounded by echoes of failed promises. I began to understand that asserting myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. It was a lesson in self-preservation, in understanding that sometimes the most radical act of love for oneself is saying no before someone else forces you to. His name was Michael, or at least, that's what everyone called him. To me, he was a complicated presence, a shadow in the corners of our home, a man whose promises seemed to float in the air, unanchored to reality. My mother had been seeing him for nearly 4 years, a secretive arrangement that the rest of the world might have judged harshly. But in our household, secrets had always been a part of life. What mattered most was survival, keeping the fragile balance from tipping into chaos. Michael was nothing like the men my mother had married before. He had a kind of charm that was easy to believe in, a smooth confidence that made it easy to overlook the inconsistencies in his stories. He would laugh easily, lean casually against our kitchen counter, and make remarks that suggested he understood more than he did. But there was a tension behind his eyes, a flicker of hesitation when he thought no one was watching. That told a different story. For over 3 years, he had promised my mother that he would leave his wife, a promise repeated so many times that it had begun to lose its weight. Each declaration was met with hope on my mother's part and skepticism on mine. I had learned early on not to trust his words too easily. The problem wasn't just his marriage, it was the pattern. Words unfulfilled, intentions that never materialized, a life built on the edges of reality rather than fully stepping into it. I had met his wife once, or maybe twice. She was a shadow as well, described vaguely by him. A woman with a collection of cats and a penchant for marijuana, according to Michael. But I never met her myself. She existed only as a vague, almost mythic figure, a reason he always gave for why he couldn't make a full commitment to my mother. And though I tried to dismiss it, a part of me couldn't help but feel that the boundaries he maintained were deliberate, a way to keep us all at arm's length. The first time I realized just how serious the situation was, Michael had casually mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he was planning a trip to Spain. Nothing unusual about travel, of course, but then he added that when he returned, he intended to start moving his belongings into our house. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. My stomach had tightened instantly, a knot of anxiety forming as I imagined the consequences. It wasn't just that he wanted to live with us, it was that our Our carefully maintained refuge would be irrevocably altered. The rhythm of our mornings, the quiet corners of my room, the shared spaces where my cousin and I had carved out a sense of safety, all of it was threatened by the presence of a man whose loyalty was questionable at best. I began to notice the small things, the details that made me wary. The way Michael's eyes would flicker when my mother mentioned a plan or a routine, as if he were weighing whether he could bend it to his will. The casual comments that implied entitlement, the subtle suggestions that he had a right to more of our lives than he had earned. And yet, he smiled so easily, laughed so convincingly, that it was hard to confront the truth without appearing irrational. I found myself watching, always observing, cataloging his movements and words, like a detective tracing a pattern. Every step, every glance, every casual remark carried a weight I could feel. I saw how my mother's eyes lit up when he was around, how she seemed to forget the weariness that had settled into her posture over decades of disappointment. But I also saw the cracks, hesitations, the unspoken tension, the glimpses of fear I could read in her subtle sighs. It was a complicated dance, one I had learned to navigate over the years. Michael represented everything my mother wanted and nothing she could fully have. He was a living contradiction, a promise without fulfillment, a presence without permanence. And as the day approached when he planned to make our home his own, I felt a mixture of anger, fear, and a sense of inevitability. Because no matter how much I tried to shield myself, I knew that change was coming. Our house, our sanctuary, would have to accommodate another person, another set of desires, another layer of unpredictability. And I wasn't sure I was ready to fight for my space. Though every instinct screamed that I should. As I lay awake at night, imagining the shift in our household, I began to understand something fundamental about myself. I could no longer be a passive observer. The boundaries I had tolerated, the patience I had exercised, were no longer sufficient. Michael's potential move into our home wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a challenge to my right to feel safe in my own life. And so, I waited, heart heavy and mind alert, for the day when I would have to face him, my mother, and the tangled web of promises, lies, and hopes that had become the invisible architecture of our lives. By the time evening fell, our house seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that something monumental was approaching. I wandered through the familiar rooms, taking in the worn furniture, the photographs lining the walls, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the corners, and I felt a wave of ownership, of quiet protectiveness, wash over me. This was my home, our home, and yet I knew that soon, it might no longer feel that way. I thought about Michael, about the casual way he had mentioned moving in after his trip to Spain. It was as if he assumed we would all simply rearrange our lives around him, as if our routines, our sanctuary, and the delicate equilibrium we had maintained for years were insignificant in the face of his desire. A knot of frustration twisted in my stomach. How could someone act with such entitlement, without considering the people whose lives would be disrupted? My mind kept returning to my mother. I loved her fiercely, but love did not make me blind. I could see how she clung to the idea of Michael, how years of disappointment had made her desperate to believe in someone's promises, no matter how hollow. And yet, I could also see the strain on her, the way her eyes flickered with doubt when she thought I wasn't watching. I wondered if she understood, deep down, how much of our peace would be sacrificed if he moved in. I found myself pacing through the living room late into the night, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards keeping me company. Thoughts collided in my mind, anger at Michael's presumptuousness, fear of confrontation, guilt at even feeling justified in resisting him. Was I selfish to want him gone? Was I being unreasonable to guard my space so fiercely? And yet, instinctively, I knew that my discomfort was valid. It wasn't just about convenience or comfort. It was about safety, emotional safety, the stability I had fought to preserve in a home already crowded with memories and unresolved history. I could feel it. If I allowed this intrusion, if I silently consented, a part of me would always resent it. I would resent Michael for his arrogance, my mother for her blind hope, and myself for failing to stand up when it mattered most. The thought of confrontation loomed large, terrifying in its potential to unravel everything. I imagined the conversation, my mother's eyes wide with hurt, Michael's expression sliding from charm to defensiveness, and me, trembling but resolute, trying to assert a boundary that had been ignored for too long. And somewhere, deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that this was a test not just of my courage, but of my understanding of love, family, and self-preservation. Sleep eluded me as I lay in my room, staring at the ceiling, imagining the changes, the potential arguments, the subtle but irrevocable shifts in dynamics. Every scenario played out in my mind, each one ending with me making a choice: to speak, to fight, to protect the life I had carefully carved out, or to remain silent and hope the storm passed without damage. By the time dawn approached, I realized something important. Whatever happened next, I could no longer be passive. My boundaries mattered, my peace mattered, and the decision about Michael's place in our home was no longer something I could leave to chance. I would have to speak, to act, to make it clear that our home, my home, was not a revolving door for someone else's unfinished business. That morning, as sunlight crept through the blinds and painted the walls in soft gold, I felt a mixture of dread and determination. The next few days would be decisive. Michael's arrival from Spain would bring with it the reality I had been anticipating for months. And I knew, deep down, that nothing would be the same after that moment. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of clarity. The chaos surrounding us could be managed. Boundaries could be asserted, and even love, complicated, messy, imperfect love, could coexist with respect for the individual lives we each deserved to lead. The week began with an unusual quietness in the house, a silence that felt almost deliberate, like the calm before a storm. Michael had been unusually absent, spending longer hours on his phone, speaking in hushed tones when he thought I wasn't paying attention. My mother seemed preoccupied as well, more distracted than usual, flipping through old boxes and tidying spaces with a meticulousness that suggested a shift in her mindset. It wasn't until he casually mentioned Spain that my pulse quickened. He had, with his characteristic nonchalance, explained that the trip was work-related, an opportunity he couldn't refuse, lasting 10 days. He described the itinerary with precision: flights, hotel reservations, dinners with colleagues. But beneath the surface, I could detect an underlying implication. This trip wasn't merely about work. It was a staging ground for what he planned next. From that moment on, subtle signs began to appear, like cracks in a facade. A suitcase appeared in the corner of the living room, half packed with clothes and toiletries. His laptop was brought out more frequently, often accompanied by spreadsheets or notes with headings like moving plan and future arrangements. He casually asked about our furniture, the size of my room, and whether certain areas would be available for storage. Every question, seemingly mundane, made my stomach twist with unease. My mother, blissfully unaware, or perhaps choosing not to see, responded with her usual optimism. "Of course, we'll make space," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She seemed eager to accommodate, to believe that the future Michael painted would finally materialize, ignoring the years of unfulfilled promises that had preceded it. I, on the other hand, became hyper-aware of every movement, every conversation, every subtle shift in tone. The house that had once been predictable now felt like a stage for something I hadn't auditioned for. I found myself cataloging everything Michael did: the way he measured spaces with his eyes, the casual comments about what he could contribute, the almost imperceptible pride when he suggested changes. It wasn't just a plan, it was a declaration of intent. Even my cousin noticed the tension. He approached me one evening, a knowing look in his eyes, as if he too could sense the storm gathering. "She's serious about him moving in," he said quietly, leaning against the doorway of the kitchen. "I can see it. You can feel it too, right?" I nodded, trying to mask my anxiety with a casual shrug. But inside, I was bracing for a confrontation I hadn't yet initiated. Michael's trip to Spain was not just a vacation. It was a countdown. 10 days to cement plans, to organize logistics, to mentally stake his claim in a home that wasn't fully his to take. The tension in the household became almost tangible. Every morning, I would pass his suitcase in the hallway and feel a pang of dread. Every evening, the sound of him on the phone, discussing arrangements or confirming details, echoed through the walls like a drumbeat. I felt like a passive observer, watching someone methodically prepare to enter my life in a way I hadn't consented to. And yet, I couldn't ignore the lessons I had learned from living here. People like Michael didn't change unless confronted. And even then, confrontation was a delicate dance. I needed a plan, a way to assert my boundaries without triggering a backlash that could destabilize the fragile household equilibrium. So I watched. I waited. I gathered evidence, not to use as ammunition, but to understand the pattern, to anticipate the moment when action would be unavoidable. Every detail mattered. The way he folded his clothes, the questions he asked about storage, the subtle hints dropped during conversations with my mother. They were all pieces of a puzzle that, once completed, would reveal the magnitude of the intrusion I was about to face. By the fourth day of his preparation, it became impossible to ignore the truth. Michael's arrival would mark a turning point. Our house, our routines, our sense of peace were all about to be tested. And deep inside, I felt a mix of fear, anger, and a quiet determination. This was not just about him moving in. It was about protecting the life I had carved out for myself amidst years of uncertainty and chaos. The days crawled forward with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each one stretching longer than the last. Michael's preparations for his impending move became more conspicuous, yet he maintained that casual, charming demeanor that made it impossible to confront him outright. Every action, every word seemed calculated to assert his presence without overtly declaring it. And I, trapped in my own sense of helpless anticipation, became acutely aware of every detail. I watched him from the corners of rooms, pretending to be engrossed in a book or my journal. I noted the way he assessed the furniture, the precise placement of his suitcase, and how he casually inquired about what items might be moved or discarded. Every question, every glance, was a test, a probe into the boundaries of our home. And every time, my pulse quickened with the realization that he was slowly staking a claim, one that no one had explicitly given him. My mother, blissfully hopeful, remained oblivious to my rising tension. She had a way of seeing only the future she wanted, the vision of life she longed for with Michael. She unpacked his suitcase with a smile, rearranged rooms, and hummed as though she were preparing for a celebration instead of a confrontation. I couldn't decide if her ignorance was bliss or a deliberate choice to ignore the obvious. Either way, it left me standing on the edge, poised between duty to my mother and the need to defend my own space. Every night, I lay awake, my thoughts spiraling into countless scenarios. What if I spoke up too soon? What if I waited and let him fully settle in before voicing my objections? The consequences weighed heavily on me. I knew from experience that confrontation in our household was like stepping into a storm without an umbrella, unpredictable, violent, and leaving fragments of what you tried to protect broken in the aftermath. I considered my cousin, who seemed to intuitively understand the tension. We had long shared a quiet camaraderie, and I wondered if he might side with me if I sought his counsel. But even that was complicated. Our family dynamics were intricate, layered with loyalty, love, and unspoken rules. He might sympathize, but he would not or could not intervene in a way that would change the inevitable. I found myself rehearsing conversations in my mind, crafting arguments that balanced truth with tact. I envisioned my words carefully, choosing phrases that asserted my boundaries without appearing combative. I respect your intentions, I would say, but this home is not just yours to claim. There are other lives here that need consideration. I could hear the polite tone in my head, the calm yet firm delivery that I hoped would make him see reason. Yet, as rehearsed as these conversations were, doubt not at me. Michael had a way of charming, of deflecting, of turning discussions into debates where my own words were twisted into concessions I hadn't intended. He was skilled at reading people, at sensing hesitation. And I feared that any show of uncertainty on my part would become his advantage. The more I observed, the more I realized how deeply I had underestimated the psychological maneuvering at play. Michael was not just moving into a house. He was attempting to embed himself into our lives, to claim a place that had always been ours first. Every small detail, the way he placed his belongings, the way he talked about the future, the subtle suggestion that certain areas might become his domain was a reminder that he didn't see our home as a shared space. I began to map out strategies, mentally preparing for the confrontation that loomed on the horizon. It wasn't enough to react. I had to anticipate. I wrote lists in my head, what I could say, what I could refuse, how I could appeal to my mother's sense of reason without shattering her hope entirely. Every decision had a ripple effect, and I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. And yet, amidst the anxiety and careful planning, a strange sense of empowerment began to emerge. For the first time, I recognized that my discomfort was valid, that my instincts were not just protective, but necessary. I didn't have to resign myself to chaos or passivity. I had the right to defend my life, my space, my peace. Still, fear lingered. Fear of confrontation, fear of judgment, fear of damaging my relationship with my mother. I knew that standing my ground would not be easy. The coming days would test not just my courage, but my ability to navigate a delicate balance, asserting boundaries without causing irreparable harm. By the 8th day, the tension had become almost unbearable. The suitcase in the corner, the casual questions about furniture, the meticulous organization of his belongings all served as constant reminders that the inevitable was approaching. Michael would soon return, and with him would come the reality I had been preparing to face. And as I watched, waited, and rehearsed, I realized one undeniable truth: nothing could remain the same once he stepped back through that door. Our household, our routines, our sense of stability would all be challenged. And I would have to decide, finally and irrevocably, how much of myself I was willing to fight for. The day Michael returned from Spain arrived with an almost ceremonial weight. I could feel it from the moment I woke up. The house, normally a quiet sanctuary of familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft footsteps of my cousin in the hallway, the clatter of my mother moving about felt electric. Charged with anticipation and anxiety, I paced through the living room, my eyes flicking repeatedly toward the front door, waiting for the sound of his arrival. When the knock finally came, it was both ordinary and devastatingly significant. Michael's suitcase was wheeled in first, almost theatrically, followed by a small duffel bag, his confident smile greeting my mother as if he were arriving at a home he already owned. Back from Spain, my mother exclaimed, her voice warm and oblivious to the tension radiating from me. She moved to hug him, a gesture I could hardly watch without a sense of internal revolt. He returned the hug casually, his eyes scanning the room, assessing the space as though measuring it for his own use. It didn't take long for the first signs of encroachment to appear. He began moving his suitcase into what he had declared his corner of the living room, claiming the small shelf by the window for his books and electronics. He asked about drawers in the kitchen, about extra closet space, and even hinted that some of my mother's furniture could be rearranged or removed to accommodate him. Each request, framed casually as if it were a suggestion, sent a ripple of frustration through me. I watched silently, my hands clenched, as my carefully maintained home began to shift under the weight of his presence. The rhythm of our mornings, the little corners where I felt secure, were now subtly being claimed by someone else. I felt like a spectator in my own life, observing someone slowly take over the spaces I had always known as mine. Michael was careful not to be overtly aggressive, but his charm and casual authority made it clear that he expected acquiescence. "We can move this table here," he suggested. "And maybe I'll put my laptop over here, it'll be easier for me to work." His tone was light, but every word carried the implicit understanding that these were not questions, but directives. My mother, caught in her habitual optimism, nodded and rearranged the furniture without hesitation. She didn't see, or perhaps didn't want to see, how Michael's presence was already altering the dynamics of our home. I could feel my patience fraying, my desire to intervene battling with the fear of igniting a confrontation that could hurt her. My cousin gave me a subtle look, a silent acknowledgement of the absurdity and intrusion unfolding before us. He didn't say a word, but the slight shake of his head spoke volumes. We both knew that Michael's calculated actions were intentional, a gradual assertion of dominance disguised as casual adjustment. The tension escalated as Michael continued his work. He unpacked clothes, organized his belongings meticulously, and even suggested minor changes to the layout of the living room that would ultimately give him more personal space than anyone else. I felt the familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. The same sense I had felt during his preparations in Spain, now amplified 100-fold by the reality of his actions. Every small gesture, from moving a chair to claiming a shelf, felt like a violation. And yet, I couldn't act rashly. I needed to be strategic, deliberate. I watched, I waited, I cataloged everything, knowing that my moment to assert boundaries would come, but only if I prepared carefully. By the evening, the house had already shifted subtly but unmistakably. Michael's presence was no longer just a concept, it was tangible, almost physical. The spaces I had once felt belonged solely to me or to our family now bore his mark. And while my mother continued to smile, pleased with his attention and companionship, I felt the first real surge of resistance. It was no longer a hypothetical intrusion. Michael had returned, and with his arrival, our home had already begun to change. The question loomed larger than ever. How would I confront this, assert my boundaries, and preserve the life I had worked so hard to maintain? The countdown had begun, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. By the second evening after Michael's return, the atmosphere in the house had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer merely a matter of anticipation or subtle unease, it was a tangible tension that pressed on every corner of the rooms I had once considered safe. The scent of lavender seemed less comforting. The soft creak of the floorboards felt ominous. And even the familiar hum of the refrigerator seemed to echo with unspoken conflict. I spent hours in my room, pacing, rehearsing conversations over and over in my mind. Every word had to be chosen carefully, every tone measured, every gesture considered. This wasn't about winning a debate, it was about protecting my home, asserting my boundaries, and most importantly, making my mother understand the gravity of what was happening. Michael, oblivious to the storm gathering in my mind, continued his slow, methodical process of embedding himself into our lives. Every new placement of furniture, every casual remark about storage, every implied assumption that space would automatically accommodate him, sent waves of frustration through me. But beneath that frustration, there was a growing clarity. I couldn't remain passive. I had to act. I thought about my mother, and my heart ached with a mix of love and exasperation. She had endured so much in her life and clung to Michael's promises with a hope that I couldn't entirely condemn. But hope, no matter how beautiful, did not give him the right to rewrite the rules of our home. And if I failed to intervene, the consequences would ripple far beyond my own discomfort. Late into the night, I began to strategize. I listed my priorities: maintain respect for my mother, assert my personal boundaries clearly, and confront Michael with calm confidence rather than anger. I visualized the conversation, imagining him trying to charm or deflect, and prepared counterpoints for every tactic he might use. I also considered contingencies. If my mother reacted defensively, if Michael ignored me, if the house became a battleground. Every possibility needed a plan. My cousin became an important silent ally. Though he didn't speak much about it, I could tell he was aware of the tension and ready to support me in subtle ways. He would keep an eye on Michael's movements, offer perspective when I needed to vent, and most importantly, be a witness to the fairness of my argument. When the confrontation inevitably came, as I rehearsed, my emotions fluctuated wildly. Fear, anxiety, anger, determination, they all collided in a storm inside me. I wanted to run, to hide, to pretend the problem didn't exist, but I also knew that avoidance would only allow Michael to embed himself further into our lives. The decision was stark and undeniable. Either I asserted my boundaries now, or I risked losing them entirely. The day ended with a profound sense of readiness. I had rehearsed my words, strengthened my resolve, and clarified my intentions. Michael's presence was no longer a distant threat. It was an imminent reality, one I would face head-on. I understood that the confrontation might not be comfortable, that emotions could run high, and that my mother's feelings might be hurt, but I also knew that asserting myself was necessary. In the quiet moments before sleep, I felt a strange combination of dread and empowerment. The house, once a haven, was now a battlefield of wills, and while I didn't yet know exactly how the confrontation would unfold, I was prepared to stand firm, to protect my home, and to make it clear that our lives were not secondary to someone else's unfulfilled promises. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the next few days would reveal the true measure of courage, patience, and resolve I could muster in the face of an inevitable upheaval. The morning air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as I moved through the house. Michael had been up early, casually organizing his belongings, his presence now impossible to ignore. The once familiar spaces had subtly shifted. The living room corner I had claimed as my sanctuary now bore his suitcase, his books, and his subtle mark of occupancy. I knew that today was the day I could no longer remain silent. The rehearsals, the mental preparations, the countless hours of imagining this moment, they all led to this confrontation. I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands clammy, and my mind oscillating between fear and determination. I approached my mother first, trying to gauge her mood, her willingness to understand the gravity of the situation. "Mom," I began carefully, my voice measured but firm. "We need to talk about Michael moving in." She looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and mild concern. As if she hadn't fully grasped the seriousness of my tone. He's just settling in, she replied softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I thought we agreed he could stay for a while, at least temporarily. Her words, meant to calm, only heightened my anxiety. This wasn't temporary, it was a permanent shift that would affect the entire household dynamic. Taking a deep breath, I continued, carefully articulating my thoughts. I understand that you care about him, and I respect that. But this is our home. It's not just yours to adjust around someone else's plans. I feel uncomfortable with Michael taking over spaces, moving furniture, and making assumptions about how our home should be organized. Michael, who had been standing nearby, pretending to scroll through his phone, finally looked up. His expression was a mix of mild amusement and feigned innocence, as if I were overreacting. I'm just trying to make things comfortable, he said casually, his voice smooth, but with a subtle undertone of entitlement. I thought you'd appreciate that I'm taking initiative. The words hit me like a wave. Comfortable? Comfortable for whom? Certainly not for me, whose sanctuary was being dismantled piece by piece. My frustration rose, but I forced myself to remain calm. I knew that losing my composure would give him the upper hand. Comfortable for you, maybe, I said steadily, locking eyes with him. But this is a shared space. There are boundaries here, and they need to be respected. I can't stay silent while our home is rearranged without my input or consent. Michael's smile faltered slightly, and I could see a flicker of surprise or perhaps annoyance in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone so young. My mother, sensing the tension, placed a gentle hand on my arm. Sweetheart, I know it feels sudden, but I want him here. Can't we just give it a chance? I shook my head, resolute. Mom, giving it a chance doesn't mean giving up our boundaries. I'm not trying to hurt you or him, but I need my space, my routine, and my sense of peace to be respected. If that's not possible, then we need to reconsider how this move is happening. A heavy silence fell over the room. The air seemed to thicken, every sound Michael shifting his weight. My mother's soft sigh amplified in the tension. I could feel the stakes. This conversation would define the next phase of our household. There was no turning back. Michael finally spoke, his tone sharper now, though still attempting to mask it with charm. So you're saying I can't have any say in how I fit into your home? His question carried an edge that hinted at potential escalation. Yes, I replied firmly, standing my ground. You have your life, we have ours. We can coexist, but this home isn't yours to claim. That needs to be clear. My mother's eyes welled slightly, torn between her loyalty to Michael and her understanding of my perspective. I could see the conflict in her, the tug-of-war between hope and reality. And in that moment, I realized that asserting myself was only half the battle, the other half was helping her see why boundaries mattered. Why respect for my space was not an act of defiance, but an act of preservation. The first confrontation ended without shouting or doors slamming, but the tension remained thick, almost tangible. I had spoken my truth, drawn my line, and planted the seed for the next stage of negotiation. Michael might push back, my mother might resist, but I had begun to assert control over my life and my home on my own terms. The hours following our first confrontation hung heavy over the house. Each room seemed charged with unspoken words, every footstep and movement amplified by the tension that had taken root. Michael, who had until then worn a mask of casual charm, began to reveal glimpses of frustration, subtle but unmistakable. He moved through the living room with a deliberate precision, arranging his belongings as if to assert that he belonged here regardless of the argument we had just had. His movements were almost theatrical, sliding books onto shelves, placing personal items in corners I had long considered my own, all while maintaining a polite, almost a friendly smile. It was infuriating. My mother, meanwhile, oscillated between concern for me and concern for him. I could see her internal struggle clearly. On one hand, she wanted to maintain peace. On the other, she was desperate not to lose the man she had clung to for years. Maybe we just need to adjust slowly, she said, attempting to soothe both of us. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying her uncertainty. I could not adjust slowly. My instincts screamed that any delay would only allow Michael to embed himself further into our lives. I needed a plan, a strategy, a way to reclaim my home without igniting a full-blown conflict that could shatter the fragile equilibrium. The next day, I observed him meticulously. Every comment he made about furniture, every suggestion about shared space, every subtle implication that he had a right to more of our home was cataloged in my mind. I wrote lists in my journal, noting the most pressing issues, prioritizing what I could confront first, and mentally rehearsing the language I would use to make my case. The emotional strain was immense. I found myself exhausted by the constant vigilance required to navigate our home. Simple tasks: making breakfast, passing through the living room, even sitting quietly in my room felt weighted by the knowledge that Michael's presence was no longer optional. And my mother's optimism could not shield me from the reality of the situation. I began noticing how he subtly tested boundaries too. Comments disguised as jokes, casual questions about space, offhand remarks about my routines, all of them calculated to gauge my tolerance. I realized with a mixture of anger and clarity that Michael was not simply moving in. He was attempting to normalize his presence, to make it inevitable. The emotional toll on me was compounded by seeing my mother's hesitation. I understood her position, her desire to protect her hope and avoid conflict, but that didn't make it easier to feel invisible in my own home. Every time she excused his actions or deflected my concerns, I felt my resolve harden. I would have to be the voice of reason, the anchor of stability, even if it meant standing against both of them. By the end of the day, I had constructed a mental map of the upcoming confrontations. I knew that patience and timing were crucial. Any rash action could escalate into an emotional battle that would hurt everyone, but delay meant losing further control over our space. My decision was clear: I would speak up decisively, with confidence and clarity, making my boundaries impossible to ignore, even as Michael unpacked more items. Claiming spaces with the ease of someone convinced that accommodation was a right rather than a privilege, I reminded myself of my purpose. This confrontation was not about defeating him or proving a point. It was about safeguarding my home, my peace, and my autonomy. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the living room that now bore his mark, I felt the resolve solidify inside me. The next conversation would be decisive. The tension had been building for days, and by late afternoon, it felt like the entire house was holding its breath. Michael's subtle tests, his quiet claims to space, and my mother's hesitant concessions had pushed me to the edge. I knew that waiting any longer would allow the situation to spiral beyond control. It was time for the confrontation I had been rehearsing. The conversation that could finally set boundaries once and for all. I approached the living room with a steady breath, determined to speak with calm authority. Michael was arranging his books again, his movements precise, almost deliberate. My mother sat on the couch, a hopeful smile on her face, but I could see the worry lurking behind her eyes. She knew something serious was coming. "Mom, Michael," I began, my voice firm but measured. "We need to talk seriously about how this move is happening." I could see Michael straighten slightly, the charm still present, but the edge of caution appearing in his eyes. He replied casually, "Sure, what's on your mind?" His tone suggested he didn't fully anticipate the seriousness of what I was about to say. "This is our home," I said, locking eyes with him. "And while I understand that you want to move in, there are boundaries that need to be respected. I cannot accept you rearranging spaces, claiming areas as your own, or assuming that our routines will bend around your presence. This isn't negotiable." Michael's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "I thought we were making this comfortable for everyone," he said, the casualness now tinged with defensiveness. "It's only comfortable for you." I shot back calmly but firmly. "This home isn't just yours. You've moved in, but that doesn't mean it's yours to claim. Mom, I need you to understand this too. We can't let our desire for hope or companionship erase the boundaries that protect our lives." My mother's eyes filled with emotion. She hesitated, caught between the man she loved and the daughter she wanted to protect. I just want him to be happy," she murmured, voice wavering. "I understand that," I said gently, turning to her. "But happiness doesn't mean compromising the people around you. Michael, this isn't about stopping you from being part of our lives. It's about ensuring that you respect the lives of those already here." Michael leaned back slightly, a subtle shift in posture that indicated the first crack in his confident demeanor. "So, what exactly are you saying?" he asked, a mix of frustration and curiosity in his tone. "I'm saying," I replied firmly, "that you can visit, you can spend time here, and you can be part of our lives, but moving in permanently, claiming space, and rearranging our home without full agreement is not acceptable." If you want to stay here, it will be on terms that respect everyone in this household." The room was quiet. My mother's expression softened, as if she was beginning to understand the gravity of what I had said. Michael's eyes flickered between us, his charm momentarily muted by the clarity and confidence in my voice. Finally, he sighed, a small but significant gesture of acknowledgement. "All right," he said slowly. "I hear you. I didn't realize it felt so overwhelming. Maybe we need to figure this out more carefully." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. I had spoken my truth, set clear boundaries, and forced recognition of the impact his actions had on our lives. My mother nodded slightly, her trust in me and in the fairness of my argument shining through her conflicted expression. For the first time since his arrival, the tension in the room eased slightly. The confrontation had been intense, but it had established a framework for negotiation and respect. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I also knew that I had taken control of my life in a way that was necessary and unavoidable. After the intensity of the confrontation, the house felt different. The air, once heavy with tension, now carried a tentative sense of relief. Michael, for all his charm and calculated movements, seemed to pause, as if he were reassessing not only his position in the house but also the assumptions he had carried for so long. He lingered in the living room, carefully placing his belongings without overstepping any boundaries I had asserted. There was a subtle acknowledgement in his posture, a slight deference that had not been there before. "I get it," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I need to respect your space." My mother, still visibly emotional, approached me with a soft smile. "I didn't realize. I didn't see it from your perspective," she admitted. Her voice carried the weight of years of hope and disappointment, but also a newfound clarity. "You're right. We can't ignore your feelings. I want us all to be comfortable here, and I see now that means listening to you." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and residual tension. It wasn't a perfect solution, and I knew the days ahead would still require negotiation, patience, and constant communication. But for the first time, I felt a sense of empowerment. I had taken control of my space, asserted my boundaries, and made it clear that respect was non-negotiable. Michael, surprisingly, offered a tentative olive branch. "Maybe I overstepped," he said, his tone subdued. "I didn't realize how much this affected you. I'll take a step back and we can figure out a schedule or some kind of plan that works for everyone." It was not the resolution I had envisioned. He wasn't leaving, nor was he completely surrendering his presence, but it was progress. Progress meant that our home could remain a shared space, and that my voice had been heard. That was the victory I needed. Later, as the evening settled in, I walked through the living room and took in the changes. The corners Michael had claimed were still his, but now they felt negotiated, contained, manageable. My mother joined me, and we shared a quiet moment of understanding. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic apologies, just a recognition that boundaries had been established and respected. I realized something crucial. Asserting myself had not damaged our family, it had clarified relationships, reinforced mutual respect, and protected the stability we all depended on. Michael's presence no longer felt like a threat, but like a challenge we could navigate together, provided that respect remained central. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in weeks. The house, though still slightly altered, felt like home again. I had faced the storm, set my boundaries, and emerged with clarity and confidence. And I knew that whatever came next, I could handle it. I had proven to myself that peace and autonomy were not privileges to be taken lightly, they were rights I was willing to defend. The days after the confrontation carried a quiet rhythm that was both comforting and fragile. Michael had adjusted his behavior, moving with a sense of awareness that had previously been absent. He no longer claimed corners of the living room without consideration, and his presence, while still noticeable, no longer felt like an invasion. I spent time observing this subtle shift, noting the ways he now asked before rearranging anything, sought approval before bringing in new items, and even attempted small gestures to show consideration. It was as if the confrontation had imprinted a new respect into his behavior, respect I hadn't dared to hope for. My mother, too, seemed to breathe easier. The tension that had previously shadowed her smile was replaced by a calmer optimism, tempered with realism. She had begun to see the value of boundaries not just for me, but for herself as well. I realized that the confrontation had not been a rupture in our relationship. Rather, it had clarified it. We could love and support each other without allowing hope to cloud judgment or enable disruption. For my part, the experience had strengthened something within me. I had faced fear, anxiety, and the delicate balance of family loyalty versus personal autonomy. I had learned that speaking up, even when difficult, was necessary for preserving peace and integrity. Every decision, every word, every carefully chosen gesture had contributed to a new equilibrium in the household. The house itself seemed to respond to this renewed sense of order. Spaces that had felt contested were now shared with an understanding that boundaries were respected. The living room, the kitchen, even the hallways once battlegrounds of silent tension had become neutral territories again. Places where we could coexist without constant negotiation. Michael's presence, though still an adjustment, was now predictable, manageable, and even tolerable. We established simple routines and clear expectations. Certain rooms remained private, communal spaces were shared with mutual respect, and any new plans or changes were discussed in advance. It was not perfect, but it was functional, a framework that allowed us all to live without constant friction. Reflecting on the experience, I understood that the lessons extended beyond the practicalities of living arrangements. I had discovered the importance of asserting boundaries, of being clear and direct in communication, and of respecting both my own needs and the needs of others. I had learned that hope and optimism, while valuable, could not be a substitute for accountability and consideration. The emotional aftermath was not without its challenges. Moments of tension still arose, and there were occasional reminders of the confrontation's intensity. But each time, I felt equipped to handle them. I had discovered my voice, my agency, and the courage to maintain them, even in the face of discomfort or resistance. As I sat quietly in my room one evening, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft shuffle of Michael's movements, the occasional laugh of my mother, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. We had navigated a complex, emotionally charged situation and emerged with clarity, respect, and a new understanding of each other's limits. It was not the life I had envisioned in every detail, but it was one I could inhabit with dignity, confidence, and the assurance that my boundaries would be honored. And in that realization, I found peace. Over the following weeks, the household began to settle into an unexpected rhythm. Michael's presence, once a source of tension and unease, had become something more neutral, even predictable. It was remarkable how quickly respect and clear boundaries could transform the atmosphere when they were consistently reinforced. I noticed the small gestures first. Michael asking before using the kitchen for extended periods, placing his belongings neatly without encroaching on communal spaces, and even occasionally helping with tasks around the house without expectation of praise. These acts, seemingly minor, carried immense significance. They demonstrated an understanding that our home was a shared space, not his private domain. My mother's approach shifted as well. She became more attentive to both Michael's needs and mine, facilitating conversations and mediating small disagreements before they could escalate. Her optimism remained, but it was now tempered with a new appreciation for boundaries and respect. I realized that the confrontation had not damaged her love for Michael. It had strengthened her capacity to maintain fairness while still nurturing her relationship. For me, life regained a sense of normalcy that had been absent for months. I could move freely through the house without the constant anxiety of territorial disputes. I could enjoy quiet moments in my room, cook meals without negotiation, and participate in conversations without the looming shadow of confrontation. I felt a renewed sense of agency in my daily life. A reminder that asserting boundaries does not equate to rejecting love or companionship, it equates to preserving one's dignity and peace. The household, now operating under unspoken agreements and shared respect, became more harmonious. Even Michael, whose prior approach had been calculated and self-assured, seemed to benefit from the clarity. He appeared less defensive, more cooperative, and surprisingly, more genuine. Without the constant friction, he could integrate himself without undermining the established dynamics, creating a more balanced environment for all of us. I also discovered that communication was key. We began to hold brief check-ins in the evenings, discussing schedules, plans, and adjustments that might be necessary. It was not formal or forced, but a natural outcome of mutual respect. This routine prevented misunderstandings and allowed all three of us to feel acknowledged and heard, reinforcing the balance that had been so precariously established. Emotionally, I felt lighter. The confrontation, while intense, had been a necessary turning point. I had learned that clarity and firmness, when delivered with empathy and respect, could prevent prolonged tension and resentment. I had also learned that boundaries were not static. They could be negotiated, maintained, and adjusted as circumstances evolved, provided that all parties committed to mutual respect. By the end of this period, the house no longer felt like a battleground, but like a home again. Spaces were defined, expectations were understood, and relationships, though complex, had matured. I felt proud of the way I had handled the situation, and I realized that growth often came through conflict, not comfort, even in quiet moments. When I reflected on the months of uncertainty and tension, I could see how far we had come. Our home, once fraught with anxiety and unease, had transformed into a place where respect, communication, and understanding allowed us to coexist peacefully. And in that realization, I found a sense of satisfaction that went beyond mere resolution. It was the assurance that my voice, my boundaries, and my agency mattered. As the days turned into weeks, I began to reflect more deeply on the journey we had all undergone. The chaos, tension, and uncertainty had left their mark, but they had also created a space for growth, understanding, and self-awareness. I realized that the confrontation with Michael and the boundary setting with my mother were not merely about physical space. They were about asserting my identity, my values, and my emotional well-being. I learned that boundaries are not barriers to love or connection. They are frameworks that allow relationships to thrive without suffocating the individuals within them. By asserting my needs clearly and calmly, I had not only protected my own sense of peace but had also provided a structure that allowed Michael and my mother to navigate the household more harmoniously. One of the most profound lessons was understanding the importance of speaking up early. Waiting or suppressing my feelings would have only allowed resentment and frustration to build, making eventual confrontation more explosive. I discovered the power of clarity. Stating my truth with confidence and respect immediately shifted the dynamics and prevented further escalation. I also realized the significance of empathy. While I was firm in my stance, I had to consider my mother's hopes and Michael's perspective. Balancing empathy with assertiveness was challenging, but it became clear that understanding others' emotions did not mean sacrificing my own. Instead, it allowed me to communicate in a way that was firm yet compassionate, creating a pathway for resolution rather than conflict. Through this experience, I grew in self-awareness and emotional intelligence. I could recognize the subtle power plays, manipulation, and charm tactics that Michael had initially employed, and respond in a way that maintained my integrity. I learned to trust my instincts and value my own voice, realizing that my feelings and opinions were valid and deserving of respect. Another important lesson was about family dynamics. My mother's optimism and desire for companionship were understandable, yet they could not override the needs of other household members. I learned to navigate these complexities with patience and tact, advocating for myself while still nurturing the familial bonds that mattered. Most importantly, I discovered the resilience that comes from facing uncomfortable situations directly. I had feared confrontation, but through it, I found empowerment. I learned that peace is not the absence of challenges, it is the ability to meet them head-on and emerge with clarity and dignity intact. In quiet moments, I reflected on how much our household had transformed. The once tense spaces now carried a sense of balance, where respect, communication, and understanding allowed everyone to coexist without constant friction. And I understood that this equilibrium was not a gift, it was the product of courage, patience, and deliberate action. I realized that growth often emerges from conflict, and that asserting oneself is not selfish, it is necessary. By protecting my boundaries, I had preserved my sense of self, reinforced my relationships, and created a framework in which love and respect could coexist with autonomy and dignity. Months had passed since the confrontation, and the rhythm of the house had finally settled into a comfortable, balanced pattern. Michael's presence, once a source of tension and anxiety, had become normalized in a way that respected boundaries while still allowing for connection. The living room, the kitchen, and the shared spaces carried no lingering sense of ownership struggle. They were places where coexistence was possible and mutually respected. I, had learned to navigate the subtle give and take of living with others while maintaining my autonomy. Mornings were calm, with Michael quietly preparing his coffee while I read in the corner of the living room. My mother, now more attentive to both of our needs, facilitated communication without judgment or interference. The house, once thick with unspoken tension, now felt open and breathable again. What struck me most was the peace that had settled within myself. I no longer woke with a knot of anxiety, anticipating a conflict or intrusion. I had found a voice that could assert boundaries with confidence, a presence that could enforce respect without aggression. My home felt like my own again, not in the sense of exclusivity, but in the sense that it was a space where my rights, feelings, and routines were honored. Even Michael, who initially seemed intent on claiming space as if it were his own by right, had adjusted to this new dynamic. He now operated with a quiet awareness of our household rhythms, asking before acting and demonstrating small but meaningful gestures of consideration. It was not perfection, there were still minor disagreements, but the foundation of respect had been established. My mother's optimism, once fragile and easily swayed, now complemented her awareness of boundaries. She could nurture her relationships while supporting mine, balancing hope with realism. I realized that our family had grown not through avoidance of conflict, but through facing it together, with honesty and mutual respect. Sitting quietly in my room one evening, listening to the soft shuffle of Michael moving around the house and my mother humming in the kitchen, I felt a profound sense of contentment. The storm of tension had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. I had preserved my peace, reinforced my voice, and established a home where respect and love could coexist. I understood that life was not about total control or perfect harmony, it was about balance. By asserting my boundaries and navigating the complexities of family and relationship dynamics, I had created a life where compromise did not mean surrender, where coexistence did not mean erasure, and where love could thrive alongside autonomy. As I looked around the living room, now arranged with everyone's needs in mind, I felt a quiet smile spread across my face. The journey had been challenging, emotionally taxing, and at times overwhelming, but it had brought growth, clarity, and an enduring sense of empowerment. In the end, our home had become more than a physical space, it had become a testament to patience, courage, and the understanding that respect, once established, allows love and peace to flourish. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly at home.